Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is James Roberts. Welcome to Effective, Efficient, Affordable, and above all, accountable to you. The show that takes a good hard look every couple of weeks at government Winstead style. Just a quick reminder, the views that are expressed on this show are entirely mine. I do not seek to represent the views of the Board of Education on which I serve. This evening we have a range of topics to discuss that relate both to the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education. They all speak directly to the government that we have. They all speak directly to the question, does our government work? They all speak directly to the question, do we indeed have a government that is effective or efficient or affordable or at all accountable to us, the people, to we, the people? All of the themes we're going to tackle this evening are related, but we will deal with them chronologically, and we will start with the Board of Selectmen. Not this week's Board of Selectmen meeting, but the prior meeting. By way of background, you will recall that in November's elections, this community elected a supermajority of 5 Democrats to the Board of Selectmen. Those 5 Democrats ran on a very simple, clear, unsubtle platform. The platform they ran on was that we, the Democrats, will pay to the schools, pay to the Board of Education $1.3 million immediately in recognition of our belief that we think this town has underfunded education, underfunded the MBR. Furthermore, that platform held as an inherent truth the idea that the audit was an irrelevance dreamt up by the vicious political James Roberts, that no talk of the audit should interrupt or in any way frustrate the special task of paying $1.3 million to the schools. So fast forward to that Board of Selectmen meeting. Those of you who elected that supermajority of 5 Democrats, those of you who believed the frenzied phone calls that you received in the days going up to the election, calls in which you were told that electing the Democrats would yield $1.3 million for the schools and failure to elect the Democrats would frustrate the schools. You all, I imagine, went into that meeting expecting that the schools would receive $1.3 million. And you will all have been gravely disappointed. The Board of Selectmen made no appropriation of any money to anyone. Let's be clear, ladies and gentlemen. They failed to make any appropriation of any money to the schools or to anyone else. What they said, and all they did was to say, they passed a motion that said they would adhere to the law subject to their satisfaction with the 2009-10 audit, subject to their satisfaction with the 2010-11 audit. Let us take those issues one by one. Adherence to the law. As all of you should be aware by now, adherence to the law with respect to the MBR can yield to a wide range of answers. I, for example, I've been on the record for many months now in saying that the budget that you voted for in 9-10, I beg your pardon, the budget that you voted for in the current year, the $18.6 million, adhered to the law. It met the MBR. And that any attempt to provide more money from the town, for more money from the taxpayers, was unjustified. And any attempt by the state to force the town to provide more money was illegal. There was no basis in law for that. At the other end of the spectrum, the school board believes that adherence to the law requires an immediate cash payment of $1.3 million. And there are plenty of views in between. So the Board of Selectmen have said they will adhere to the law. They will pay somewhere between $0 and $1.3 million, or if certain members of the school board believe, more than $1.3 million. But they will do so subject only to the 9-10 audit. Now, the 9-10 audit was already issued when they made this motion. They knew what was in the 9-10 audit. One could only assume that they were referring to the audit's finding that costs were questioned in an amount of $636,000 on the school board side. They presumably want someone to resolve that, to decide either that those monies must be repaid to the federal government, in which case presumably they will subtract that from the $1.3 million, or whatever lower number they choose to pay the schools. Or they want the feds to say they don't want that money. But there was a second condition, satisfaction with the 2010-11 audit, an audit which has not yet commenced. We have no idea what that audit is going to say. Although Superintendent Danny has told the school board that he expects the same problems that occurred in 9-10 to occur in 10-11. I assume that relates not simply to delays in timing, although we have already seen that that audit will be subject to delays in timing. I am assuming that the same issues with respect to costs under federal grants that arose in 9-10 will occur in 10-11. I assume, therefore, that what the Board of Selectmen is saying when they say they will adhere to the law subject to both audits is that they will pay a number of somewhere between 0 and 1.3 million, less the 636,000 that is in question for 9-10, and less, presumably, a similar number that may be in question for 10-11. They will pay up to $1.3 million, or a number lower, less $1.25 million. It sounds awfully like the Board of Selectmen, the supermajority Democrats who promised to pay $1.3 million immediately, no questions asked, irrespective of what the audit said. Sounds like they have sounds like they have had second thoughts, and they now intend to pay precisely 0. That says something, I think, about the character of the people that this community elected to the Board of Selectmen. They ran on one thing, they promised one thing. At the first opportunity, they did a 180. Now, before we get to what impact that will have on the Board of Education, and that impact is real and immediate, I just want to make one other comment about that Board of Selectmen meeting. Diverging from his colleagues, diverging from the view that the audit is suddenly real, that the audit is suddenly something that should impact the payment of $1.3 million to the school district, George Clausen ventured to suggest that the issues highlighted by the Winchester audit for 9-10 were somehow not all that serious, that the hurdles that the school district faced actually had been faced by many other communities. They were almost normal course. What do we think many other communities means to George? This got us to thinking. There are 160-odd towns in Connecticut. There are more school districts. Do we think many to George is 100 school districts that had these problems? 75? 50? 25? We asked the State Department of Education. The State Department of Education collects audits from every town and school district in the state. As you're aware, we were the only school district, the only town not to have provided an audit until November of this year. We asked them, how many other towns, how many other school districts faced the problems that Winchester faced? How many other towns had costs questioned on their ARA grants, their federal grants? Many, said George. 0, said the state. The state said Winchester was the only town ever to have costs questioned on an ARA grant. The only town. 1. So we said, how many towns, how many school districts have ever had costs questioned on any other state or federal grant? The state said, since they have begun collecting records, 12 districts, 12 school districts, 12 towns have had costs questions on a federal or state grant. So far, they have been able to identify details relating only to 4 districts, and the numbers associated with those 4 districts have been somewhere between 0 and $19,000. That is a far cry from the $636,000 that are in question for Winchester. Indeed, the only thing that seems at all common, that seems at all regular as one looks into this, is the fact that Winchester appears on this list multiple times. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. This is not the first time that Winchester's auditors have questioned costs on federal and state grants. It is, however, the first time that we have seen anything remotely resembling a problem of this magnitude. $636,000. We are the only town ever to have a problem of this nature with our federal ARA grants. So let's return to the Board of Education. Where does the non-pronouncement with respect to school funding place the Board of Education? They had expected to receive $1.3 million in cash, or at least a commitment thereto. What they got was this rather vague statement that they might get somewhere between 0 and 1.3, minus somewhere between 0 and 1.25 million. They might get 0 or something close to that, but they won't find that out until the 10-11 audit is complete, which, if this year is to be repeated, will be sometime in November of 2012. Connecticut General Statute Section 10-222 is very, very explicit. I quote, "Expenditures by the Board of Education shall not exceed the appropriation made by the municipality. Expenditures by the Board of Education shall not exceed the appropriation made by the municipality." As of this date, the appropriation made by this municipality for education is $18.6 million. The legislation is also very explicit as to what happens if a school board needs more money. In that situation, it applies to the municipality for a supplemental appropriation. I quote again from the legislation. No additional funds shall be expended unless such supplementary appropriation shall be granted. No additional funds shall be expended unless such supplementary appropriation shall be granted. Once again, the only appropriation that has been granted thus far is $18.6 million. The Board of Selectmen has granted no supplemental appropriation. It has promised no money on no time frame with no funding source. What does this mean, ladies and gentlemen, for the Board of Education? Currently, the board is operating on what is called an $18.6 million budget. If you look at the budget, the physical budget, it has a cover page. The cover page says $18.6 million. If you turn to the last page of that budget, there is a total line, a total expenditure line. That total expenditure line is $18.6 million. This is why we call it the $18.6 million budget. However, if you add up the line items, they do not total $18.6 million. They total $19.9 million. On its face, this is an illegal budget. It clearly contravenes Section 10222 of the Connecticut General Statutes that requires expenditures to be limited to the appropriation. The argument thus far has been that we expected the Board of Selectmen to appropriate an additional $1.3 million. Indeed, last week, the Board of Education forwarded to the Board of Selectmen its first financial report under the new regime. A financial report which referred explicitly to the current budget as being a $19.9 million budget. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the school board is not by law allowed to spend $19.9 million. Unless and until the Board of Selectmen allocate an additional $1.3, the school board is required by law to adhere to an $18.6 million budget, one with line items that actually add up to $18.6 million. Now, because we had been spending at a rate which assumes we're getting $1.3 million extra, we have a world of pain to go through. We need to cut a great amount of money from our current spending to revert to an 18.6 level. Now, this is a problem entirely of the school board's making. Let us be clear. There is no one at fault here but the school board. They knew from last May, when you voted, what the appropriation was. They chose to ignore that. They knew they had committed to close a building. They chose to ignore that. They knew what the law was. They chose to ignore that. They intentionally overspent from the day they opened the schools until today. Had they closed the building at the outset, had they cut the administrative staff required in connection with closing a building, not a single teacher would have been laid off. Now, the law says, in the absence of action by the Board of Selectmen to provide an extra $1.3 million, the school board must, by law, take immediate action to bring itself back to an 18.6 million spend rate. That will require a great number of layoffs. Teachers will be fired, ladies and gentlemen, courtesy of your Board of Education, who refused to see reason back in August, courtesy of your Board of Selectmen, who at the first possible opportunity reneged on their promise. So with this as a backdrop, with a need to cut $1.3 million from the budget, with a possible need on top of that to repay $636,000 to the federal government, one might imagine that the first order of business for the school board would be, how do we cut costs? Interestingly enough, that was not the first order of business when the school board met. The first order of business was the request to add to our fixed costs. The superintendent and the director of special education, or the director of PPS, asked to add to our headcount, to add a psychologist. Now, we already have 9 counselors, the collection of psychologists, social workers, and behavioralists on the payroll. But the feeling was, with the arrival of 2 children from out of district back into the system, that we needed to add a 10th. I do not yet know enough about the day-to-day workings of special education to know whether we are justified in adding a 10th such full-time person with benefits and tenure midway through the year in response to what may well be a temporary phenomenon. I don't know enough about the day-to-day operations of the school district to know whether that is educationally a good idea. I do, however, know that adding to fixed costs in the middle of the year in response to a temporary phenomenon when there is enormous uncertainty as to full-year revenues is, from a financial controls perspective, an enormously foolish choice. There is a time, ladies and gentlemen, when you add to your fixed costs. That is at the beginning of the year, in conjunction with a budget exercise. You do that when you have had an exhaustive review of all of the needs for which you will need to allocate money, all of the different ways you can spend your money, and having prioritized among them, you add where you can, where you have the opportunity. You do not add to your fixed costs halfway through the year in response to something which may be temporary, in a year in which you may already be facing a significant $2 million cash shortfall. Every child who has ever run a lemonade stand knows that if the lemonade isn't selling, you do not run indoors and ask mom to make more lemonade. You run indoors and ask mom to come out and help you sell what you have. If your revenues are questionable, you have to retrench. You don't add lemonade, you don't add staff, you retrench. Now, to be fair, there is no real hypocrisy in the school board's position on this matter. The school board has never, ever said that financial controls, financial oversight are its first concern. Indeed, the sort of thinking that I have just gone through in terms of how they should think about what they view as educational questions is abhorrent to them. They view their role not as counting beans, not as counting dollars, but of doing good. I have a simple truth to deliver to the school board. You cannot do good without cold, hard cash. If you don't have the cash, you can't do the good. Brings us to what was the first agenda item for that meeting. Item number 1 on the agenda was the district's response to the audit. The audit, which, as you recall, said a great many unflattering things about the school district. Chief among them, the fact that the school district could not substantiate the $636,000 worth of spending under federal grants was spent legally. The school district, through the superintendent, has issued multiple written responses to the audit. The first was dated November 23rd. It was posted on the school district's website. In response to a complaint from the Board of Selectmen that it was misleading and factually incorrect, that written response was withdrawn and replaced by a second, dated November 29th. A response which is equally misleading and factually incorrect. For example, the first letter, dated November 23rd, states that the school district underspent the MBR by $1.5 million. Incorrect. The second letter states that the school district underspent the MBR by $359,000. Also incorrect. Now, there are a number of troubling things here, ladies and gentlemen. The first is that a response to the audit, which never mentioned the MBR, chooses to focus on the MBR. That, in and of itself, is a strange, strange thing. The second, obviously, is the numbers change. One would think that a response to an audit whose chief complaint is that the district has no idea what its numbers are would at least get the numbers right. Thirdly, the MBR has nothing to do with spending. Whether the school district overspent the MBR or underspent the MBR is not relevant. It is no more relevant to talk about the MBR in spending than it is to talk about the color of my eyes. Had the superintendent included in his letter that my eyes were brown, that would be factually correct, but just as irrelevant. The MBR relates purely to how much money is available. It does not require the school district to spend a dime. But I think we all know what the district was trying to say. The district was trying to say that if you take what the state thinks the MBR was, and if you take the monies that the state routinely allocates to the MBR, that the school district did not have monies available to it equal to the MBR. And that is actually true. It's just that the number, the deficiency, if you like, is not $1,000,005, nor is it $359,000. It's actually closer to $250,000. You would think, again, in a response to an audit whose chief complaint is that the district doesn't know its own numbers, that they would be more precise than being wrong by 50%. Now, when challenged on this, the superintendent was honest. He basically said, His chief concern in responding to the audit was to get the message out that the school district had not overspent. He didn't really care about the MBR or about the complaints that the auditors had voiced. He just wanted to get out there the good news that the school district had not overspent. Which is frankly odd, because the school district did overspend. You, the community, voted to allocate $19.4 million in local taxes, ECS money, and what would become known as the ARA funds. 19.4. The school board spent, in local tax dollars, ECS money, and what would become known as the ARA funds, 19.8. The school board spent $400,000 more than its budget. For the superintendent to suggest otherwise is misleading. For the chair of the Board of Education to suggest otherwise is worse. Now, whilst he did not address this in writing, the superintendent did address with us, in the context of a Board of Education meeting, what he really felt was going on with the audit. His considered view is that the school district provided all pertinent, relevant information, and the auditor was too lazy to read it. You will have to make up your own minds, ladies and gentlemen, whether an audit firm of the stature of Bloom Shapiro, an auditor of the stature of Vanessa Rizzuto, a senior partner, whether you think it's credible that Bloom Shapiro was simply too lazy to read the documentation, or whether there's a bigger problem at work here. This brings us back to the Board of Selectmen, the last Board of Selectmen meeting this week. They face a similar problem to that faced by the Board of Education, an uncertain revenue picture within their budget. The potential to have to come up with $1.3 million for the schools, the potential to have to repay $636,000 to the feds. Common sense would again for them suggest that they retrench. The auditors had said the fund balance was lamentably low, unacceptably low. What did they do? Just as the school board voted to approve the hiring of additional staff, the Board of Selectmen voted to spend more of the fund balance. They chose to sell to Mike Ronzillo his tax liens at a deep discount. I'm not going to go into whether this was a good deal or a bad deal. You know my views on that. The two central elements of this transaction, as portrayed by Patsy Ronzillo this week, were that Mike had a $200,000 loan commitment and regulatory approval to put a restaurant into the facility in advance of rehabbing it. I have not yet reviewed the documentation around either of those two claims. I will do so and come back at a future show to report on their veracity. What I do want to deal with, however, is Candy Perez's claim that this was no special deal. She was at pains and went to great lengths to say this was not a special deal for Mike, for a sitting selectman of the majority party. So what did the Board of Selectmen do for Mike? They gave him a zero-interest loan repayable at 25 cents on the dollar. That is not a market loan, ladies and gentlemen. You could not go out to a bank and get that loan. Indeed, at the height of the mortgage frenzy, you could not go out and get a zero-interest loan repayable at 25 cents on the dollar with no documentation as to assets or income. Even at the height, you could not get that loan. Now, if this is not a special deal, one of two criteria must be met. Either the deal must be market, which it is not, or it must be available to all. If this is not a special deal for Mike, a special deal for a sitting Democratic selectman, a selectman of the majority party, it must be available to every individual, corporation, and nonprofit in Winchester. Candy Perez is making the argument that each of us can go to town hall at 9 a.m. tomorrow and demand our zero-interest, long-term loan repayable at 25 cents on the dollar. And because it's not a special deal, we cannot be turned down. To be turned down will be discriminatory. And to discriminate is illegal. So, what have we learned in the last 2 weeks? We have learned that a supermajority of the Board of Selectmen are willing to run on one basis and immediately reverse themselves once elected. They ran on a basis of giving $1.3 million to the school district and at the first possible opportunity said no. The Board of Selectmen ran on the basis that the audit was an irrelevance, an aggravating detail dreamt up by James Roberts. The minute they are elected, they used the audit as a basis for saying no. We learned that George Clausen believes that audit problems suffered by a single town, by Winchester alone, are somehow normal course, are somehow problems suffered by many. Many, Winchester alone. We learned that by law, the Board of Education must live by an $18.6 million appropriation and yet shows no signs of seeking to do so. We learned that faced with a $2 million cash shortfall, the Board of Education decided that this was an appropriate moment to add to staff. We learned that faced with that same $2 million shortfall, the Board of Selectmen decided this was an excellent moment to spend more of the fund balance for an off-market deal for a sitting selectman of the majority party, using as the justification that this was not a special favor. So there is a special lining, there is a silver lining, I beg your pardon, ladies and gentlemen, to all of this. The silver lining is that each of you, me, you, every corporation, every business, every non-for-profit, can line up in town hall and get our 0% long-term loan, repayable at 25 cents on the dollar. And given that we, the taxpayers, will be paying for this non-market loan, given that all of this will be coming out of the fund balance, I suggest that it's incumbent upon all of us to get to the head of that particular line. Because the first in line will get the deal, and the rest of us will pay for it. This is government Winstead style. This is government by head in the sand. This is government by have problem, spend money. This is government by insider deal. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, this is government Winstead style. If we do any more loans like we did for Mike Manzullo, the Board of Selectmen will bankrupt this town long before the Board of Education ever have the opportunity to do so. Good luck, ladies and gentlemen, because I have a funny feeling, once again, that we're going to need it. Thank you. This has been James Roberts. This has been effective, efficient, affordable, and above all, accountable to you. The sort of government that we all want, but the sort of government which sadly we do not seem to have. Thank you and good night.